We're in Genesis 31 today. Genesis 31. When you were a kid, were you ever sneaky? Did you ever try to sneak around or do something in a sneaky way? Probably all of us, right? I did, a lot. Some of the times were more, innocent. They weren't as serious. For example, every once in a while, my parents would buy us a box of Lucky Charms, and I would grab that box and sneak up to my room and munch on it, and then go return the box. Nothing too serious. Eat all the marshmallows, yeah. My brother had a wallet, and he would keep his coins and money in there. How foolish. Because when I got into it, I took his wallet and I'd go to the air vent intakes, and those looked like slots, right? And so I'd take his money and I would put it in the slot. Hear the clink when it hit the vent. We moved from that place quite a few years ago, and I still wonder if there's just money sitting in that vent collecting dust. Some of the times that I snuck around were more serious, and they don't need to be repeated here. But I will say that God has changed me a lot over the years. Today we are going to see something more serious. And we're going to see an end to Jacob and Laban's schemes towards each other. From the last chapter, they tried to outwit each other in how they were managing the flocks so that Jacob could or could not gain wealth. It's going to come with, this end is going to come with Jacob sneaking away from Laban, but in response to God's command. So, let's read chapter 31. It says, "Now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, 'Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has gained all his wealth.' And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, 'Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you.' So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field where his flock was, and said to them, 'I see that your father does not regard me with favor as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not permit him to harm me. If he said, the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped. Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. In the breeding season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob. And I said, Here I am. And he said, Lift up your eyes and see, all the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, or mottled, for I have seen that all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land, and return to the land of your kindred.' Then Rachel and Leah answered him and said to him, Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do.' So Jacob arose and set his sons and his wives on camels. He drove away all his livestock, all his property that he had gained, the livestock in his possession that he had acquired in Padan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. And Jacob tricked Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he intended to flee. He fled with all that he had and arose and crossed the Euphrates and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. When it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsman with him and pursued him for 7 days and followed close after him into the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen pitched tents in the hill country of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done, that you have tricked me and driven away my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee secretly and trick me and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourine and lyre? And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.' And now you have gone away because you longed greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods?" Jacob answered and said to Laban, "Because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force. Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have that is yours and take it." Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. So Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the 2 female servants, but he did not find them. And he went out of Leah's tent and entered Rachel's. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them. Laban felt all about the tent, but did not find them. And she said to her father, "Let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me." So he searched, but did not find the household gods. Then Jacob became angry and berated Laban. Jacob said to Laban, "What is my offense? What is my sin, that you have hotly pursued me? For you have felt through all my goods. What have you found of all your household goods? Set it before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between us two. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, and I have not eaten the rams of your flocks. What was torn by wild beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. From my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. There I was by day, the heat consumed me, and the cold by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I have been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock. And you have changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night." Then Laban answered and said to Jacob, "The daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. But what can I do this day for these my daughters and for their children whom they have borne? Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me." So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. And Jacob said to his kinsmen, "Gather stones." And they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jagar Sahadutha, but Jacob called it Gilead. Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me today." Therefore he named it Gilead and Mizpah. For he said, "The Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. If you oppress my daughters, or if you take wives beside my daughters, although no one is with us, see, God is witness between you and me." Then Laban said to Jacob, "See this heap and the pillar, which I have set between you and me. This heap is a witness, and the pillar is a witness, that I will not pass over this heap to you, and you will not pass over this heap and this pillar to me, to do harm. The God of Jacob and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us." So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. And Jacob offered a sacrifice in the hill country, and called his kinsmen to eat bread. They ate bread and spent the night in the hill country. Early in the morning, Laban arose and kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned home. That's a longer chapter, isn't it? Just wait till we get to Psalm 119. We might not have worship that night. We'll just read Psalm 119 and go right into the lesson. All right, so these first 3 verses serve to bridge the gap between the schemes of Jacob and Laban and the reasoning for Jacob leaving. There are 3 reasons for Jacob leaving. Look at the first verse. What were people saying about Jacob? Yeah, that he was taking all of Laban's wealth. We can easily see how gossip is happening in this chapter, right? Now, from the last chapter, does this accusation have any basis in fact? None. No, in fact, Laban made it exceedingly difficult for Jacob to grow his own wealth. But the fact that people were complaining that Jacob is getting rich at Laban's expense does show that some time has passed. In fact, since Jacob first came here to his uncle Laban, some 20 years have passed, as Jacob says later in this chapter. 14 years of labor for his wives, and another 6 for the growth of the individual herds and livestock. That means 6 years from chapter 30 to 31 have passed, where Jacob and Laban have been scheming and trying to outmaneuver each other. Look at verse 2. What's the second reason that led to Jacob leaving? Huh? Yeah, Laban's attitude. Laban didn't regard him with favor as before. Remember from the last chapter that Laban saw that God was blessing him through Jacob. And so Laban wanted Jacob to stick around. Well, now he's probably realizing that God was only mainly blessing Jacob. Laban, always the selfish guy, probably didn't like that. And then look at the final reason. It comes in verse 3. Why is Jacob leaving Laban? Yeah, God told him to. And when God told him to leave, he closes with a reminder of the covenant that he gave him back at Bethel in Genesis 68, verse 15. In that covenant, God promised that he would be with him. And so Jacob knows that it is now time to leave Laban. What's the natural step for him to take? To tell his family, right? If we're going to leave, the family needs to know about it. And so in verses 4 to 13, Jacob calls Rachel and Leah to him and starts explaining his reasons for wanting to leave. Look at the end of verse 5. Jacob says that the God of my father has what? Been with him, right? This is a fulfillment of that covenant in Genesis 68:15. Now, first, Jacob is still referencing God as the God of his father. Okay, he is still, I think, struggling to have a personal relationship with God at this point, although he has been taking huge strides in his growth throughout the chapters of Genesis. But still, it's the God of his father. And as we go through this chapter, we'll see that he calls it the God of Abraham, or the fear of Isaac. So there's less of a personal relationship right now, but he still recognizes him as God. And secondly, what does he affirm about God? Look at the end of verse 5 again. What does he say there? God has been with me. Look at the end of verse 7. God has what? Yeah, has not allowed him to harm him. Look at the start of verse 9. God has taken away the livestock and has done what? Yeah, given them to me. Over and over again, Jacob is affirming what about God? It is that first one. Yeah. His what? Yeah. He's affirming his faithfulness to Jacob. His faithfulness to the covenant that he made with him. His faithfulness, even though he's not recognizing it here, his faithfulness to the covenant of Abraham and Isaac. God's faithfulness has been on display for Jacob, for Laban, for this whole situation over the past 20 years. Jacob is recognizing that and speaking that to his family. And this is important again because of Genesis 28, verses 20 to 21. And that 2 verses, Jacob said, "If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I will go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God." Which, I didn't highlight this later in this lesson, but it just occurred to me that Jacob said, if he will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear. And at the end of all of this, at verse 54, Jacob offers a sacrifice, calls his kinsmen to eat what? To eat bread. Again, he's recognizing who God is here. Jacob is seeing that God has been with him, that God has upheld his promises. And so while Jacob is still struggling to have a personal relationship with God, it is becoming a firmer reality for him. And as Jacob progresses through this whole explanation here, he constantly refers back to how God has worked in this situation. And I think we can learn something here. As we go through situations in our life, they can often be hard and take twists and turns that we don't expect. But when we look back on them, we can see God's hand working through it all. And when we can do that, then that should prompt us to trust God for the situations that we're currently going through. You know, God's faithfulness in the past helps us to trust his faithfulness in the present and in the future. I think that's one of our lessons from this chapter. So Jacob continues to kind of just prop himself up and to kind of tear Laban down through all of this. Verse 6 says that he served Laban with all of his strength, and that Laban, well, he cheated him and changed his wages. How many times did Laban change his wages? 10 times. Can you imagine that? So essentially what the agreement was from the last chapter was that Jacob could have all spotted and striped sheep and goats and whatnot. That's the minority in that area of sheep and goats. And so what it seems like Laban was doing is that he was trying to interpret this business arrangement in different ways. Because Jacob said that, Laban said that you could only have the spotted ones at one point. See, that's what you must have meant by everything. And so God made all the offspring spotted. And then Laban's like, no, that's not what we meant. I think we actually meant that you wanted only the striped. And then God, of course, made all the offspring striped. And so Laban kind of flip-flops to try to cheat Jacob out of his wages. Again, he is scheming against him over and over again. And then Jacob talks about their competing plans of deceit and the dream that he had where God gave him direction. But essentially at the end of all of this, verse 13, just at the end of all this, the message is, it's time to leave, right? Let's look at verses 14 through 16. What was Rachel and Leah's response? Did they take offense at Jacob dragging their dad through the mud? No, they actually see that Laban had forsaken them too. Look at the greed of Laban at the end of verse 15. How do Rachel and Leah describe him there? They say, he has sold us and what? What? Devoured our money. That is the relationship that Laban right now has with his daughters. They feel like that he has sold them and devoured their money. You see, the two wives, which a couple chapters ago were in heated competition with each other, they completely agree together with their husband. They haven't been treated as their father's children. They've been treated as foreigners. And I mean, how sad is that? There's never a reason, even if your child sins horribly, there's never a reason to treat them as foreigners. We could be the only voice in their life pointing them to Christ. But still, Laban mistreated them, and they realized that it wouldn't change. And so, starting in verse 17, Jacob just picks up everything and leaves. And now, remember in the last chapter that part of Laban's scheme to cheat Jacob out of his wages was to take all the current spotted and striped sheep and goats, and to put a space of 3 days' journey between them, right? So news doesn't travel fast, in that day. It travels as fast as someone can walk or run. And so it took 3 days for that news to reach Laban's ears. So his scheme to cheat him out of wealth has actually hurt him in the long run of not knowing that Jacob is leaving. And then Jacob did what Jacob does. What does verse 20 say Jacob did? Yeah, he tricked Laban. He says, essentially, I'm not leaving, and then he leaves. But right before that, Rachel did something too. What did she do in verse 19? Yeah, she stole the household gods. Now, up to this point, Jacob has not been the example of faithfulness to God. He has barely claimed a belief in him. And so Rachel is still most likely in a place of polytheism, thinking that there are many gods and thus wanting to have these household gods for herself. She's in this learning process too, just as Jacob is. This will be important here, as we'll see, of course, later in this chapter. And so they head out, and it took some time for Laban to find out. And so in verse 22, how many days again did it take for Laban to find out? 3 days. And how long did it take him to catch up to Jacob? 7, all right? Take him 7 days of pursuing before he came close. And remember that by now, Jacob had quite a bit of wealth, of livestock, of family and servants. And so his movement would have been much slower than a band of men hotly pursuing him to bring him back. I wonder just how often he kept looking behind his shoulder to see if anyone was in pursuit of him, right? I mean, you're leaving under the cover of night. You're tricking the person who wants to have all your wealth. You're taking all your wealth with you, all your family, everything. He's probably not just thinking, hey, I'm just going to be able to get away scot-free, right? He's probably worried. He probably has anxiety this whole time. But God intervenes through a dream. What does God tell Laban? Yeah. Be careful not to say anything good or bad. Isn't that interesting? You see, Laban's greatest power, if you went back and read through these last few chapters, his greatest power came in his ability to convince Jacob to do things. Laban had the power of persuasion. He had the power of persuasion, and it was because of his persuasiveness that Jacob continued to stay with Laban for so long. Jacob works for 7 years to have the hand of Rachel. Laban gives him Leah and convinces him to work another 7 years for Rachel. And then he convinces him to stay when Jacob wanted to leave in the first place. And over again, Laban has the power of persuasion, over Jacob. God was essentially warning him not to say anything to influence Jacob to return or to even continue on his way. This is an opportunity for Jacob to show his faithfulness to God, but it's restraining Laban as well. He shouldn't use flattery. He shouldn't use threat. His time of influencing Jacob was over, and God would not allow it to continue. Let's look at verses 25 to 30. We see that Laban has overtaken Jacob. Jacob pitched his tent. This is in verse 25. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen pitched tents in the hill country of Gilead. So they've set up tents over against each other. Jacob, who was attempting to flee, probably saw Laban, which is why he set up his tents, making this stop more involved with all of his family and friends. And Laban came to him and starts to over-exaggerate. Yes, Jacob tricked him. No, he didn't drive his daughters away with a sword. But this type of greed that Laban the type of greed that Laban had usually grows out of a narcissistic pride. A pride that says he deserves everything. This type of pride is what led him, I think, to mistreating his daughters, and his daughters willingly leaving him. And we're going to see this kind of on full display in just a little bit when Laban starts saying things like, everything you have is mine, all your daughters are mine, all your children are mine. Okay, we're going to see this kind of in a more condensed form in a little bit. But this greed would also make him think that there was no reason that his own flesh and blood would betray him. Okay, this kind of narcissistic pride, everything he deserves, everything good, everything is supposed to be nice for him. Why would my daughters ever leave me, even though I mistreat them horribly? So that's what he's expressing here. Now, do you think that Laban would have actually sent Jacob away with a celebration, like he said in verse 27? No. No, again, these are empty words. And he tries to put some weight to those empty words by saying that he wanted to at least say goodbye to his grandsons and to his daughters. Now, the Hebrew here, let's see, in verse 28, it says, "Why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly." So the actual Hebrew here says, "kiss my sons." Most commentators believe that it was just meant to mean grandsons. So to say, "Why did you not permit me to say farewell to my grandsons and daughters?" Either or it worked. I mean, the Hebrew word could refer to both, so both make sense. I just wanted to kind of point that out. Your translation might just say grandsons instead of kiss my sons. That's the reason why. But then Laban gives an empty threat. He says that he could harm Jacob if he wished, but then immediately follows it up with how God is restraining him. He says, verse 29, "It is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father," again, this isn't the God of Laban, "but the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.'" And then what question does Laban close with in verse 30? Why did you what? Steal my gods. Of everything that is going through Laban's mind, this is probably the most authentic question for him. Everything else, he's been kind of just puffing himself up. The God of Jacob's father, as he said, intervened on behalf of Jacob. So if Jacob was to follow any god, it would be his God, right? So why would he steal Laban's household gods? So Jacob first answers why he left. Verse 31, "Because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force." Okay, he gives two underlying reasons that he didn't address at the beginning of this chapter. What's the first one? He's afraid. And the second one, Laban would take his daughters away by force. See, Jacob's fear of Laban and what could happen prompted him to sneak away. How often do we do that? How often do we allow our fear to dictate our actions? I think we've probably all done that often in our lives. It's taken quite a bit of time. It can take time for us to learn to trust God and allow Him to work and not try to take matters into our own hands. But again, I like to highlight the same lesson because it's just present in every single chapter of Genesis, I think, that we shouldn't try to accomplish things in our own strength. We should trust God, not in our own strength. Over and over again, we kind of just see this learning curve happening in Genesis. See, God told Jacob to leave Laban and that he would be with him. Jacob, though, because of his fear, made sure to sneak away. Now, we can't say for sure what would have happened if he didn't sneak away. We only know what did happen. But even if the ends did justify the means, we would never take that to mean that we should doubt God. Again, trust God, trust His faithfulness. Don't try to accomplish things in our own strength. But then Jacob speaks, I think, hastily. Verse 32. "Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live." That's a pretty stark thing to say, right? He didn't know what Rachel had done. He says that anyone who took the gods would be killed. And this gives us another quick lesson. We need to consider the words that we use before we use them. Because he doesn't know what happens here. He speaks confidently. He doesn't know that he shouldn't be speaking this confidently. And so, verse 33, I like this. What is the first tent that Laban goes into? He goes into Jacob's tent. I bet he hoped that he found the gods there because then he would have a reason to kill Jacob and take everything back that he wanted. How disappointed he must have been. Still, he didn't find them in his tent or in anyone else's. And Rachel is a quick thinker, right? Isn't she? The best place that she could hide the gods was to sit on them. And I like the way that she explains it. The way of the woman is upon me. Laban's like, I'll just leave it at that. And then at verse 36, Jacob, after all of this happens, Jacob becomes angry. He berates Laban. Verse 36, and Jacob became angry, berated Laban. Jacob said to Laban, what is my offense? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? He clearly sees that Laban is doing wrong and is overreacting. Again, let's just read this whole thing again for a second. What is my offense? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? For you have felt through all my goods. What have you found of all your household goods? Set it before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between us two. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, and I have not eaten the rams of your flocks. What was torn by wild beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. From my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. There I was by day, the heat consumed me, and cold by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I have been in your house. I have served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. Jacob is clearly angry. He is clearly upholding his integrity. These are years of pent-up emotions coming out here. First, he protests his innocence. There is no reason that justifies this pursuit. And then he expresses his anger for how Laban has treated him for 20 years of service he offered. Imagine that, 2 decades of service. And you can clearly see that God has been with him this whole time. Jacob says this in verse 38. He says, your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried. Now, I only know a little bit about, calving or, sheep giving birth. But I don't know that 2 decades of not having a single miscarriage is the norm, right? I mean, God is clearly working in this situation to make sure that everything is going good. Jacob has worked tirelessly for Laban. He's worked in the heat of day, he says, in the cold of night. He's been deprived of sleep. He has been mistreated. He has not been fairly compensated. Jacob is justifiably angry. And in verse 42, Jacob says that Laban would have sent him away empty-handed if it were not for who? God. Again, Jacob is learning that God is faithful, that he is there, that he's watching after him just as he watched after his dad and his grandpa. And again, though, Jacob does take kind of an impersonal approach to God, even after all that God has done, and even though Jacob knows that he wouldn't be standing there if it wasn't for God, he still says, the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac. The fear of Isaac, by the way, means that Isaac held God in reverence, not that he was afraid of him. Although a proper, I think, reverence of God is also a recognition of the great power of God. Let's look at verses 43 to 44. Here is Laban's greed and narcissistic pride on display. The daughters are whose daughters? Yeah, Laban says they're his daughters. The children are his children. The flocks are his flocks. And all that you see, and because they're in the midst of Jacob's everything, all that you see is mine. That's a lot of pride and greed on display there. I mean, he utterly fails to recognize reality. He claims Rachel and Leah. He claims Jacob's sons. He claims Jacob's flocks. He claims everything of Jacob's as his own. That's the mentality of Laban. That was the mentality of Laban all along. To Laban, Jacob is stealing all of these things from him. I mean, how just horribly dense of Laban. Laban clearly entered into numerous agreements with Jacob for Jacob to rightfully marry his daughters and gain his flocks and his servants, not to mention that Laban has absolutely no right over Jacob's children. I mean, can you imagine that? If my dad came and said that my children were his, that just makes no sense. And yet, that's what Laban is saying. He's saying, these are mine. See, this is what pride and greed produce. Laban fails to understand reality. He is blinded by his pride and greed. And so one thing I wrote on the board is that we can, kind of a sub lesson for us, is that pride produces greed, and pride and greed can blind us to reality. When we make money our be-all, end-all, we cannot serve both God and mammon, as Jesus teaches. And then he tries to look like the good guy here. At the end of verse 43, what's his reason for not taking them back? He wants to do right by his daughters and their children. But again, he's just recognizing that he is constrained by God, and he's just almost admitting defeat. And so he and Jacob make a covenant. Verses 45 to the end, Laban's side of the covenant is that he won't cross the heap of stones that they made unless he finds out that Jacob is oppressing his daughters and taking new wives. And he also doesn't want Jacob coming over to his side to harm him. Laban calls the place Jagar Sahadutha, which means heap of witness in Aramaic. Jacob calls the place Gilead, which means heap of witness in Hebrew. It's interesting that Laban calls God the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, and the God of their father, and yet does not call him his God. It underlines the fact that Laban is polytheistic and that he has his own household gods. And Jacob still does the same thing. He swore by the fear of his father Isaac. But again, I think Jacob is really learning and really starting to grasp here God's faithfulness, God's presence, and just how God has been with him throughout this whole time. The next morning, Laban leaves and returns home. So yeah, that's chapter 31. And again, we see God's faithfulness on display through it all. We see that we need to trust God and not in our own strength. We see that pride can lead to greed, and that both pride and greed can blind us to reality. We see that we should watch what we say, that we shouldn't speak too hastily like Jacob did. Yeah, this continues to teach us just, I think, again, about God's providence in our life, that he is there with us. Any other thoughts or questions or comments into this chapter? All right, we will look at chapter 32 next week. And that one looks like it's a little bit shorter, right? So we'll be good. All right, you all have a good night.